On May 4, 1945, the wrecked Tangermünde bridge over the Elbe River became the center of the last desperate German exodus of the war. Once a modern steel span, it had been blown apart by retreating Wehrmacht engineers weeks earlier. Now the twisted mass of metal and fractured concrete functioned as the final passageway to the American lines. Tens of thousands of German soldiers and civilians crawled across the mangled structure in a single narrow file, clinging to the hope that surrendering to the Americans meant survival. American intelligence in the 102nd Infantry Division sector had been tracking unusual radio traffic for days. Wehrmacht units across northern Germany were abandoning positions en masse, destroying remaining equipment, and converging on the Elbe. What intercepted signals revealed was not a coordinated military maneuver, but the largest voluntary surrender movement in Western history. The figure climbing toward the Elbe was staggering, an estimated 100,000 civilians and soldiers pushing toward the same shattered crossing point, driven not by strategy, but by fear of Soviet captivity. For months, German commanders had known the terrible reality awaiting their troops in Soviet hands. Intelligence reports circulating within the Wehrmacht estimated that less than half of all German prisoners captured by the Red Army would ever return. As the Soviets pushed relentlessly west, advancing 20 to 30 kilometers a day, the German calculus became brutally simple: reach the Americans or die trying. American forces had halted at the Elbe line in accordance with political agreements made at Yalta, leaving the destruction of Berlin to the Soviets. What Allied planners had not foreseen was how this halt line would transform into a magnet for collapsing German forces. Captain William Patterson of the 405th Infantry Regiment witnessed the unprecedented sight through his field glasses. The remnants of an army once feared across Europe, now streaming together in a river of uniforms, ragged banners, and starving civilians.
Behind this collapse lay a humanitarian disaster of continental scale. Millions of German civilians from East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia were fleeing the Soviet advance. Their columns, families, elderly, children, the wounded, moved at a fraction of the speed of the approaching Red Army. Tales of atrocities in the East fueled the panic. Internal German intelligence assessments suggested that if refugees remaining between the Elbe and the Soviet armies were overrun, casualties could reach into the millions. Within the Wehrmacht, the first major shift came on April 20th. Hitler ordered General Walter Wenck and his 12th Army to counterattack toward Berlin. Instead, Wenck chose defiance. In a briefing to his commanders, he declared that the war was lost and that their final duty was not to the regime, but to the soldiers and civilians depending on them. Wenck's decision to move west and carve open a path to the American lines became one of the last major acts of humanitarian leadership by a German commander. His intelligence chief, Colonel Günther Reichhelm, had gathered horrifying statistics from areas overrun by the Soviets. Wenck understood that holding even a narrow passage for a few days could save tens of thousands. As Wenck maneuvered his forces westward, American frontline observers began witnessing surreal scenes. German units approached in tight formations with headlights on, making no attempt at combat readiness. Officers saluted American positions, and entire battalions marched forward under white flags. These troops were not broken remnants. Many still had ammunition, weapons, and discipline. They simply preferred surrender to the Americans over annihilation or Soviet imprisonment.
By late April, the rate of voluntary surrender skyrocketed. Thousands surrendered daily. Some units arrived so intact that they formally presented their battle flags during surrender. A remarkable flow of radio messages intercepted by American intelligence showed German commanders actively reassuring one another that Americans were honoring the Geneva Convention and providing medical care and food. After years of total war, such treatment seemed almost unbelievable, but it spread like wildfire through German ranks. For many, this was the first sign of mercy in years. But the road west was perilous. SS units, still loyal to Hitler, established blocking detachments, executing soldiers attempting to flee. The catastrophic breakout from the Halbe pocket, where more than 200,000 German soldiers and tens of thousands of civilians tried to escape Soviet encirclement, became symbolic of the collapse. Soviet artillery, rocket batteries, and tanks turned forest tracks into killing grounds. Only a fraction, perhaps 40,000, managed to reach Wenck's lines. Tens of thousands perished or were taken by Soviet troops, many of whom would not survive captivity. Against this backdrop, Wenck's 12th Army accomplished one of the most underappreciated humanitarian operations of the war. He established a defensive corridor nearly 40 kilometers long, using his last remaining ammunition and reorganized divisions to hold back Soviet forces long enough for refugees to escape. His headquarters functioned as a command post, relief center, and logistics hub. Soldiers gave their rations to children. Medical staff used their final supplies treating civilians. Wenck himself was constantly at the front, encouraging exhausted teenagers and elderly Volkssturm militia to hold the line for one more day. Meanwhile, at the Tangermünde crossing, German engineers on one side and American engineers on the other cooperated to stabilize the destroyed bridge. The atmosphere was surreal. American MPs and German military police stood only yards apart, jointly controlling the flow of humanity. Officers saluted one another. Engineers shared tools and ropes. Everyone understood that if the bridge clogged or collapsed, thousands would be stranded when the Soviets arrived.
From May 4th to May 7th, roughly 100,000 soldiers and civilians crossed the ruins. They came in every imaginable state. Uniformed divisions marching in order. SS generals in full regalia requesting honorable surrender. Naval personnel who had not seen a ship in months, and young female auxiliaries terrified of falling into Soviet hands. Families pushed carts filled with bedding and possessions. Children were passed hand to hand across dangerous gaps in the bridge. The injured were carried or wheeled across on hospital beds. American medical and logistical capabilities were soon overwhelmed. Divisions built to feed 15,000 men suddenly found themselves responsible for 60,000 prisoners plus civilians. Delousing stations, field hospitals, and soup kitchens ran non-stop. Many German surrenderers suffered from starvation, untreated infections, or wounds that had festered for weeks. American doctors performed surgeries around the clock. Clayton trucks shuttled supplies from depots. Transport aircraft dropped emergency rations. The Red Ball Express, famous for supplying Patton, was reactivated not for American troops, but for surrendered German forces. Yet the political situation was precarious. At Yalta, the Allies had agreed that German forces must surrender to all Allied powers equally. The mass westward movement threatened this arrangement. American generals, including Bradley and Eisenhower, found themselves balancing diplomatic obligations with the raw human needs